Okay, this morning we're gonna look at some ideas from one of Dr. Ernest Holmes' favorite authors, who was Ralph Waldo Emerson, and we're looking specifically at ideas that he expressed probably most succinctly in his essay called Self-Reliance. But the same theme that you will find in his essay Self-Reliance, it unfolds. It appears in many of his other works. It was kind of like this was a driving theme of his life and something that he was expressing, and no matter what subject he was talking about, it came out. So it's kind of like no matter what topic we're talking about on a Sunday, we're always talking about divine love and divine love expressing through the individual. We're talking about the unity of life. And we talk about it many different ways because sometimes we have to hear it many different ways in order to fully absorb it. But Emerson's ideas on self-reliance is that kind of a generative theme. I mean, it's a generative theme that appears in many of his works. So as ministerial students, of course, we had to study Emerson's essays. We had to study their influence on Dr. Holmes, and we had to become familiar with those ideas. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history, but then we're going to go into the meat of this idea of today's talk. Trust thyself, and that's a direct quote from Emerson. Trust thyself. You have to learn to trust yourself. Think of of one of the maxims that was written at the temple for Apollo at Delphi, and it was know thyself. Know thyself. Right? If we really know ourselves, if we really trust ourselves, how different might our lives be? How different might this world be? So just a little bit of history here of Emerson and Holmes and where they came together and how much Emerson influenced Dr. Holmes' life is probably worthwhile, because when you read Dr. Holmes, you're reading many of the same ideas that you're reading in Emerson, expressed in Dr. Holmes' own unique way. So Ernest Holmes was born, I believe it was 1888, late 1880s, in a little town of Bethel, Maine, which at the time was considered to be the backwoods, the woods country. You know, lumber and things like that were kind of the primary industry. And the home that he grew up in, according to a very loving biography that was written by his brother Fenwick, only had 3 books. They had the Bible, they had a children's illustrated Bible, and they had another book called Natural Law in the Spiritual Universe by, I believe it was Henry Drummond. I think it was Drummond who wrote that. I have a copy of it. I actually found it on a used book seller site one time, and I got a copy of it. And those were the only books that they they had as they were growing up. But Dr. Holmes' mother was apparently a very open thinker for her time, and she encouraged the children to think for themselves, to question, to ask, to explore. You know, she called Ernest her little question mark because he was always so full of questions. And I think those of us who have children, you know what that experience is like when they question you to the void. But why, Daddy? But why? And finally they get you to say, they get you to say the thing you swore you'd never say, the thing your dad told you, which was because I said so, because I said so. But Ernest was a very curious boy, and his mother used to attend lectures. They before television, before radio, they had lecture circuits. I think it was called the Chappaqua circuit. If not that, something very similar to it. But these lecturers would go from small town to small town, and they would go to a lecture hall, and people would come and pay whatever it was in those days, a few pennies or a nickel or whatever, and they would listen to these lectures. That was the way that they got both entertained and educated. And I believe it was at one of those lectures that Mrs. Holmes picked up Drummond's book. So she was open to the influx of new ideas. She was listening to new ideas, and she was encouraging the children to ask and to be curious and to be playful and not to be fearful. Fenwick tells a story, or relates a story one time where they got a new preacher in town, and the father was driving the boys in a buckboard, a horse-drawn buckboard, and he took them to church, and they all listened to the sermon together. And on the way back home, the father pulled the horse over to the side of the road and turned around to the boys, and he said, "Now listen." He says, I don't want to talk mean about the preacher, the new preacher that we have. I don't want to tell you anything bad about him, but you need to know that when he said that God sees you crawling as a worm in the dust, he was just flat out wrong. Just flat out wrong. And with that, he giddy up the horse, and they went back home. So you have to imagine then this child growing up in this environment where it was okay to think, it was okay to question, it was okay to ask, and it was okay to reject conforming to ideas that told him that he was less than, that he was no good, a worm in the dust, right? Another kind of endearing story is that when Ernest was about 10, at the church they had the organ, and it had pedals, and the organist had to push their pedals with their feet to operate the bellows for the organ, and then they also had all of these pedals. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these big church organs, but in addition to the keyboards, there was many different pedals that the organist would use to change the pitch or the tone or some aspect of the way that the organ sounded. So they were busy pushing with their feet to get enough air to play the organ, and then they were moving the other pedals and they were playing their hand. They had an awful lot to do. So what they would do is they would recruit young boys, and a young boy would lay on his belly underneath the organ and push the foot pedals with their hands. That's what they would do. And of course, if the organ wasn't playing, there wasn't a whole lot for the little boys to do down there. So Ernest Holmes, that was his job when he was a little boy, and he would bring comic books. So he would lay there on his belly reading comic books until it was time to play the hymn, and then he would start pushing the pedals with his hands, so the organist had air moving through the pipe organ to play the organ. So I'm just trying to paint this picture of this curious little boy, this little boy who was happy to be alive, this little boy who knew it was okay to question, who knew it was okay to ask, and who explored life kind of wide open like that. And when he got to be about 19, he moved to Boston, and I believe it was to go work at one of his brother's businesses. One of the brothers had moved to Boston and had a business there. And it was there that Ernest Holmes discovered the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had not been exposed to them before. And Dr. Holmes said it was like taking a drink of cool water on a hot summer day when he found Emerson's works. And the reason for it was Ernest had already worked through many of these ideas on his own. He had kind of formulated the same opinions. He had reached the same conclusions. And now here he was finding somebody who thought like he did, who preceded him and who wrote like he did, and he just embraced the teachings. Now, Ernest then moved out to Ventura Beach, California, where his brother Fenwick was a minister out there, a Congregationalist minister. And Ernest moved there and took a job, I think it was as a procurement and purchasing agent for the Parks and Recreation Department out there. And Ernest and Fenwick used to go around and give lectures at the libraries and different halls, much like the lectures that their mother had attended. They would go out and lecture, and they became known as the Holmes brothers Emersonian lecturers. Okay, so I'm just trying to help build a picture of how important Emerson's ideas were to Ernest Holmes as he was formulating what we would come to know as the science of mind. Now, of course, there were other teachers who had influence on Ernest Holmes. One of his associates there in Boston, his boss's wife, I believe it was a Christian Science practitioner, and he studied with her, and he learned all about Christian Science and treatment as it's taught in Christian Science. And he went and he studied with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was known as the teacher of teachers. And many of her students went on to found different ministries. Unity was influenced by them. Divine science was influenced by them. Many different teachers. I think she graduated over 1,000 students from her seminary college in Chicago. But nevertheless, it was Emerson's ideas that kind of struck a chord in Ernest Holmes, and that's why we want to come and look at them today, talk about them today. Now, Emerson himself was, I think, the original Yankee hippie, and his protege, Thoreau, followed. But Emerson, for his time, his ideas seemed very radical, very different than the established, organized church and religion of the day. So we have to remember that area of the country, the Massachusetts area, that the first English settlers in there were largely the Puritans, and the Puritans were rebelling against anything that looked Catholic in in the Church of England. What they wanted to purify the Church of England from what they perceived to be remnants of Catholicism. So we have this image growing up, whether it's right or wrong, but we have this image growing up from stories that we read and movies that we see, the Puritans being very strict, putting people in stocks and, tying them with their head and their hands into wooden stocks and making them stay outside in the weather if they violated some law, or, was Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, kind of somehow ostracizing people for breaking their laws and not living by their strict religious laws for the colony. So their idea was, sort of a utopia. They were going to have this colony, and everybody was going to believe the same, and everybody was going to worship the same, and everybody was going to follow the same laws. And of course, that didn't quite work out. And even when I was doing some of my genealogy, I was able to trace back to some of my ancestors who were in that lot, came over in about 1636, and had the Puritan names, Mercy and Prudence and Chastity and all of these names that they gave the girls. But a few generations later, they started to intermarry with other people of other beliefs. And what was left of the Puritan preachers kind of moved into Congregationalist churches and some Presbyterian churches. So Emerson was a Congregationalist minister. Emerson kind of came from that stock that we would normally look at and say, oh, well, this Cotton Mather, this guy must be very strict and lots of dogma and lots of creed and lots of rules and lots of regulations. And he was anything but that. He was totally different for his time. So much so that he was invited to give an address to the graduating class at the Harvard Divinity School, and I think that was in 1830. And of course, it was all like 8 students in that entire graduating class. And Emerson rocked the establishment with his talk, and you can find it online if you just search for Emerson Divinity School address. You'll find it, because he came right out and now told all of these young men who had trained to become ministers and go into the field and to take a pulpit somewhere. He told them that there was a great error. There was a great error in the Christian religion as it had evolved, that it had moved away from the principles of what Jesus himself taught. And they had created the man Jesus to be just like another god like Apollo or any other god that any other religion has. And what he was telling them is don't go into the field and don't be kind of teaching dogma and creed and trying to get people to remember and recite things your way, right? But teach them to go within and find the God within. Teach them the true religion. Now today we would say, yes, of course, where are we going to find God? Where is any of us going to find God? It's not out there. It's not in a church. It's not in a building. But it's within, right? Within our hearts. And this is what Emerson was extolling them to do. This is what you need to do. And it raised such a ruckus that he was ostracized. He wasn't invited back for over 30 years because he was attacking the very establishment that these people were training to keep going. But in 30 years' time, things changed and people started to realize how brilliant he was. And he was welcomed back then as a great thinker. And again, that the theme that we find in self-reliance was the same one that he was telling these young preachers. We have to help people to go within and find the God within, to find the God within. So I think you can kind of see how that theme, that generative theme, that idea would resonate with a young mind like Dr. Holmes. It's okay to be curious. It's okay to ask. It's okay to question ideas, especially when those ideas put you down. There's something wonderful inside of you. There's something fabulous right here, right now, but you have to find it. And no one can find it for you. You must find it for yourself. So with this spirit, then we kind of look at some of these things that Emerson told us, and kind of, I would say, challenged us to do. But these ideas are as true for us today as they ever were. Now, I do need to just kind of go back to the models of the 3 levels of consciousness that I keep talking about, because to me that kind of explains the evolution of the soul, the evolution of consciousness, and it explains a lot about society. So in that first level where people come to organize, it's a stage that we all go through, but in that first level, all of the power is out there somewhere. And what we must do is we must obey. We must do whatever that power tells us to do. And we must find ways to please those in power so that they will give to us the things that we need, because everything is out there. Money is out there. Opportunity is out there. Power is out there. Politics is out there. Everything is out there. So we kind of spend our time, the first part of our life, we spend our time trying to figure out how to work within that system, how to get ahead within that system. You go to school and you say, well, which jobs pay the most money? I'll train to get that job. It's never, well, what is it that strikes your fancy? What is it that makes your heart sing, What is it that makes you want to dance with joy? No, it's, we need to go do this because this is what pays the most money. Or we need to go do this because this is the idea of service that our family has or our community has, and we need to go into this profession. I was watching a TV show the other night, and there was a man on there who had been a doctor, a medical doctor, and he was a medical doctor. His father was a medical doctor, and not only was his father a medical doctor, but his father was on the board of this teaching hospital where this young man worked. And he went into medicine. That was kind of like what the family did. They went into medicine. And he said the hardest thing he had to do was to call his dad and say, Dad, I'm going to stop practicing medicine and I'm going to go out and be a stand-up comic. And he thought his father was going to say, what, are you crazy? All these years of medicine. His father told him, he said, son, life is short. Do what makes you happy. Life is short. Do what makes you happy. So in that first level of consciousness, then, there's this idea that all we have to do is we have to do what somebody else tells us to do. We have to believe what somebody else tells us to believe. We have to behave in the manner that somebody else tells us to behave, and that's all we have to do. And then, of course, when we die, we get to go to heaven, and everything is wonderful. And that's okay. That's a necessary stage of development. It serves its place, it serves its time, because what we learn in that stage of our life is discipline. We learn to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. And that is a most important skill, because if we don't have that, and we try to go out and embark on something else, we will always fail because we don't have the discipline to do what needs to be done to move further. So just keep that in mind. At the first stage of life, we have to learn how to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. But at some point as we're maturing, usually in the late 20s, early 30s, at some point we start to question. We start to ask ourselves, like this young man who says, am I really happy practicing medicine? I would really like to go out and be a stand-up comedian. At some point we start to ask for ourselves, well, that was all right for everybody else, right? But what about what's right for me? And this, of course, is what Emerson called conforming. Society tries to make us conform to society's ways. They try to make us behave in a certain way. They try to make us do what they want us to do. They try to get us to do, in essence, what is good for society, you know. We all need to adopt a role to help the society grow, and that's about it. That's about the purpose of life. And of course, Emerson in the essay says that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. At some point we start to grow and we start to realize, wait a second. I have a mind of my own. I can think for myself. Why do I need everybody else to tell me what to do or what's good for me or what occupation I should go to or what roles in life I should fulfill? Why can't I figure those things out for myself? Why can't I trust myself enough to listen to my heart, to know thyself, to trust thyself? That's a major stepping stone. It's a major shifting point in our lives when we get there and we start to say, yes, everything I've learned so far has helped me get where I am, but now I have to question and ask whether or not it's true. Speaking for myself, I think probably the greatest day in my life with regards to spiritual growth was the day that I woke up and said, you know, everything that I have ever believed is possibly wrong. It doesn't have to be. It could be true. But unless I explore and examine and turn over each and every idea and decide for myself whether or not it's true, I won't know. And that was a quest then to identify, what is it that I do believe? How do I know what I believe? And how do I know if what I believe is true? So this is what Emerson is speaking to, at least the way that I interpret it. This is what Emerson is speaking to, is right there at that borderline between level 1 consciousness and level 2 consciousness, which level 2 consciousness is about learning, it is about growing, it is about knowing. Right there at that borderline is where he is telling us the foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. He says we have brilliance within us. We have wonderful ideas within us. We have these ideas that come up. We have these things that we look at, and then part of us says, oh, well, no, that could never be. That would never work. You know, that's a silly idea. I can't do that. And then somebody else goes and does it. And what he says is we have to see our own genius handed back to us by another person. We're kind of eating crow. We have to see, I had that idea. I thought of that. That was a great idea. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't pay any attention to that. Now, there's something about life that we have to at least be aware of, right? And that is that in the human existence, it's almost like we're stuck in between two worlds, the physical world and the spiritual world. It's almost like we're heading down a river in a canoe, and we've got 1 foot in each canoe. We've got 2 canoes, 1 foot in each canoe, and we've got ourselves balanced, and we're going downstream, and everything there is fine. Of course, until we hit a little bit of rough water, or we have to go around a rock or something like that. So we have this part of us that craves stability. We want things to be certain. We want to know how they are. We want to get up in the morning and know that the coffee is in the same spot in the same closet that it has been for the last 30 years. You know, we want that sense of consistency. And that's more or less the material part of us. And then part of us wants to be surprised. It wants to be exhilarated. It wants to have great adventures, and it wants something different. See? And it's almost like we are torn between these two parts of living, these two parts of our lives. And if you look at our society, everything about our society is telling us to conform and to accept the advice of the elders and to do what other people are telling us to do. And yet the people that we put out as heroes to admire are the nonconformists, are the ones who march to the beat of their own drummer, you know. Everybody you tell your kids, now you got to go to school, you got to graduate, you got to get a good education. And then we have somebody like Richard Branson or Bill Gates who didn't finish school. You know, I think Branson may have dropped out of high school. Gates certainly dropped out of college, because at that time they knew they had something. You see, there was something within them that they said, "This is it. See, this is it. I don't need all of this other information. I don't need this diploma. I don't need this piece of paper. I have got something valuable here, and I am going to go pursue it." So we put those folks out on a pedestal, and we say, yeah, well, that's the great individual spirit, you know, here in our country, where you can go forward and have an idea and take it to fruition. But then if our kids come home and say, I'm gonna drop out of school and I'm gonna go start a record company, or I'm gonna drop out of school and start to build these things called computers, you'd go, what? What are you, nuts? You know. You got to stay. You got to get your diploma. You've got to get your education. So it's not just our kids we do that to. Of course, we do that to ourselves, and our parents did it to us because everybody thought the way to teach us to survive was to conform. To conform. But now when it comes to our spiritual growth, that is very much like death, see? That is stagnation. We haven't been created to conform. We've been created to celebrate our uniqueness. See, each and every one of us is unique. We're all different, you know. We're all wonderful in our own way. There's a song that only you can sing. There's a dance that only you can dance. There's something that you can do like no other, like no other. And that's the joy of the heart that's calling to us. You see, but it's not the intellect, and it's not the ego, and it's not going to come to us from society, because society wants us to conform. It's only going to come when we know ourselves, when we trust ourselves. So we have to, as we start to come of age, so to speak, as we start to come unto our own, perhaps as the prodigal son tells us, right? As we start to come into this realization that I have to do it my way. There's no one else who can do it for me. There's no one else who knows what I need to know. If I don't know it, no one will know it. Then our quest, this is when the journey changes, see? So up until that point, our focus has been out there on the world external, on the things that those in power tell us to do, in the things that our parents tell us to do, in the things that our government tells us to do. And at this point, when we start to come of our own, it changes. The locus of control changes. The focus turns within. Now we are embarking on the greatest journey we can ever make. So just one little bit more about this boundary line between level 1 and level 2, between the Orthodox and between the Gnostic, right? Gnostic, Gnosis, gnosis, is a knowing. And this knowing starts out as a knowing through education, through information, through listening, through reading, through exploring, through meditating, through periods of being alone. So we start out, first of all, it's knowing what others have taught. But there comes a time where the knowing comes from within. As Ernest Holmes says, there comes a time when we just want to be at home with the beloved. There comes a time where the only one who can teach us is the one who is within. So that is kind of where we start with gnosis by a desire to know, and at the end of that stage, it is an inner knowing. It is not an intellectual knowing. It is an intuitive knowing. It is a knowing that is without process of knowing. This is what I was talking about last week with the flashes of cosmic consciousness. So one of the qualities of the experience of cosmic consciousness, or the mystical experience, or the transcendental experience, called by many different names, is this sudden knowing of things that we have no way to know. We just know, and we just know that we know. And nobody can tell us we can't. We do. We just know. And we know things that we just know. So it is this experience of unity. It is this experience of total love. It is this experience, I call it dipping your toe into the omniscience. There's this glimpse, there's this flash. And then we start to move out of the second level into the third, which is the mystical level. So if you look at the organization of the Christian church, the early days of the Christian church, Paul, the apostle, and much of what we have on Christianity today comes to us from Paul, either things that he wrote himself, things that people he taught, wrote, works that he did. Much of the New Testament that we have is influenced by Paul. And Paul never knew the person Jesus. Paul knew the resurrected Jesus. Paul knew the Christ, and he always referred to Jesus as Christ Jesus, not Jesus Christ. Interesting. But Paul's experience was the mystical experience. He was knocked off the horse. He was blinded by the light. There was this sudden inner knowing. And his argument with the Orthodox people, the people who had been building the church, was that his experience, which was an inner knowing experience, was just as valid as the experience of the people who listened to Jesus when Jesus walked the face of the earth. Paul was Gnostic in that regard. And there was a schism, there was a split between, or a struggle between the Orthodox Church and the followers of Paul. And eventually it was resolved when the Orthodox Church kind of brought Paul's ideas back in, and instead of Paul being an enemy, he was kind of brought back in as a principal character. And if you're interested in exploring that, if you're just curious as to where this all comes from, I recommend a book by Elaine Pagels, P-A-G-E-L-S, called The Gnostic Paul. And what she does is she goes through the writings of Paul, and she pulls out these ideas that were clearly Gnostic ideas that could not be concealed, that whoever was kind of editing and rewriting things was not quite aware of what it was that they were leaving in. And these ideas got left in. So much like if you read the New Testament, you'll come across words that are Aramaic words because they didn't translate into any other language, right? So the original spoken language was Aramaic, and these words got carried forward because they defied translation, which kind of tells us that the original was the Aramaic. You can look at the writings of Paul and you can find these ideas that are clearly Gnostic ideas. So the struggle between the Orthodox and the Gnostic continued on into like 500 or 600 AD, which was the Gnostics were saying, it's not just good enough to know what somebody told you. You have to know what you know for yourself. And the organized church, the authorities, the bishops, they were outraged by this. They were just outraged that somebody would defy their authority. That, of course, what they said was the right way and the only right way, and anybody who would question them was gambling their fate for eternity, because they would surely be condemned and sent to hell forever and ever for questioning their authority. So this is this kind of struggle that has always been going on, always been going on. And you will find it in every religion, in any philosophy. You will find it even in political organizations. You will find fundamentalists, and you will find people who say, but wait a minute, what are the principles we stand for? You know, what's really behind this? So what Emerson is calling us to do in his essay, Self-Reliance, and I think what resonated with Dr. Holmes, because Dr. Holmes is telling us the same thing, is we have to be willing to commit to knowing ourselves. We have to be willing to commit to trusting ourselves. Now, where are we going to do that? Where are we going to do that? Are we going to do it in a building somewhere? Are we going to do it in a cave somewhere? You know? Are we going to go live on a desert island somewhere? Free ourselves from the distractions of humanity. Turn all of our devices off. Turn all of the lights off. Just sit and stare at a candle. And the answer is that there is no physical place where we're going to do that. Or perhaps the answer is that it is any physical place that we're going to go do that. That it is every physical place that we are going to go do that. Now, quiet and solitude and avoiding distractions and turning off devices and turning out the lights and lighting a candle to meditate, they are all conducive to going within, but it is within where we will find. It is within. It is only within. It is not without. It is within. Because even what we perceive out there, when I look out the window and I see the trees blowing in the breeze, I'm not seeing the trees blowing in the breeze out there. I am perceiving it in my consciousness. And I'm pointing to my head, but my consciousness is not in my head, right? That's a myth in our society. Other societies, they point to their navel. That's where consciousness is. So everything that I know and everything that I perceive is only in consciousness. Only in consciousness. And wherever I go, it is there. Wherever I go, it is there. So we don't know what consciousness is, right? Scientists can't tell us what consciousness is. We're reading Selby's work on the physics of God, and they talk about the hard problem of consciousness, you know. I mean, think about this. Your computer is intelligent. It can solve very complex mathematical problems, but it is not aware. Or at least we don't know that it's aware. Unless, you know, like 2001 Space Odyssey, where the computer takes over. The computer is intelligent, but it's not conscious. It is not aware. It is not aware of what it is doing. It is simply carrying out the instructions of the coding that has been given. But we are aware. So probably the best thing we can say of consciousness is awareness. And then we have, for lack of a better way to describe it, a field of awareness. A field of awareness. It's like your TV screen is on and there's stuff going across your screen. That's your field of awareness. We don't know how things get on the screen. We don't know where they come from to get on the screen. We don't know where they go to when they're not on our screen. Maybe they're just sliding from my screen to the next door neighbors. We don't know. See, we don't know. But the best we can say about consciousness is that things come into our field of awareness. Now, just as we have to become kind of selective about what ideas we accept, what ideas we believe, right? So just because somebody in authority told us that this is the way it needs to be, maybe not. We need to be selective about what we just blindly accept or choose or follow. We need to learn to do that with the things that appear on our field of consciousness. Everything that appears on our field of consciousness, we don't have to follow. We don't have to believe. We don't have to accept. And part of the problem is that as we have been growing and maturing, we have so identified with the the ideas that appear on our field of consciousness, we think that they are ours. We think that we are them. So if a sad idea appears on our field of consciousness, we think, oh, I'm sad. If an angry idea appears on our field of consciousness, we think, oh, I'm angry, you know. If a question appears on our field of consciousness, we think, oh, I need to go find the answer to that. And as we start to come into our own, you know, we become more like the parable, the Buddhist parable that we talk about. Perhaps, just perhaps, there's a sad thought. I am sad. Well, perhaps not. So in coming to know ourselves, see, we can't trust ourselves if we don't know ourselves. And we can't trust anything if we can't trust ourselves. Because what is it that's trusting anything? So somebody tells me that you know, that this is good and that is bad, and I say, well, I'm going to trust that. Well, if I can't trust myself, how can I trust my judgment of saying I trust that? You see, I've got faulty judgment to start with. So I may ignore the problem, but I really can't trust it. I really can't trust my own judgment. And this is important because so much of traditional religion has taught us not to trust. You can't trust yourselves. You can't trust the human life. You can't trust the flesh. You can't trust your own wants or desires. You know, they could be coming from an evil place. And what Dr. Holmes told us is we don't need anybody to tell us what is good and what is not good because we already know. We already know. So the first step then is in ignoring or disengaging, or the correct term that I'm looking for, well, correct is relative, but the term that I'm looking for is we must be the witness. We must be the observer. So instead of thinking that everything that everybody tells us is our truth, instead of thinking that everything that appears on our field of consciousness is our truth, we must become the observer and say, perhaps, know thyself. I am not the thought. I am the one observing the thought. I think in the New Testament this was called going into your prayer closet, being still and knowing, right? Communing with God. See, because once we get past that noise, that background noise of all the stuff that's going on in our lives, in our heads, see, then we start to open ourselves up to a different way of knowing. And that is our intuition. That is our intuition. Holmes tells us that when God speaks to us in the language of our heart, which is intuition. And we sometimes miss it because we're listening with our intellect, our intuition. So once we have learned to separate from the chatter of the monkey mind, once we have learned to be still, then we can know. Right? And an old adage, be still and know. And from the East, they tell us, you know, stop making ripples on the surface of the pond if you want to find the jewel that's below the surface. Be still, and let the magnificence that is there start to come forward. And as we start to do that, as we start to become more in tune, right? Mindfulness meditation, just be aware, be here now and be aware. As we start to become more aware of what our own self, what our intuition, what our inner guidance is telling us to do, then we can test it. Then we can go follow it. Then we can learn how to know more clearly when it's trying to tell us something. You know, for everybody it's different. For each and every person it's different. But if we are to be self-reliant, we have to know ourselves, and we have to come to find out what that is. We have to find out what that is so that we can get better at following the guidance. Dr. Holmes tells us, you know, if you needed to know something, I mean, just think about this. We exist within omniscience. Everything that there is to be known is known. We exist in that. It's kind of like we're floating in this sea of omniscience. And if there's anything that we need to know, no matter where it is, no matter how far away it is, if there's anything that we need to know, it's available to us. It is available to us. But we have to trust. We have to trust ourselves. We have to trust that this information comes to us in a manner that we are capable of receiving. And we have to be willing to put that stake in the ground as Emerson did when he gave the Divinity School address. If you've ever seen the movie Brother, Sun, Sister Moon about the life of St. Francis of Assisi, Bertolucci put a very dramatic scene in that movie where the young Francis has his spiritual awakening and he realizes that he cannot continue to live the life that his father wants him to live as a successful merchant and businessman. And he goes out into the town plaza and he takes off all of the clothes that his father has given him. He strips naked in the plaza. And he leaves the town with nothing on his back because his trust is now in God. Very dramatic scene, you know. In screenplay, you'd call that a threshold moment. You know, he's crossing the threshold. He's leaving the one world. He's going into another. But our lives are full of threshold moments, each and every one of us. And there comes a time where we have to say, I am not going to accept anything because anybody told me. I don't care whether Emerson told me. I don't care whether Dr. Holmes told me. I don't care whether Jim told me. I am going to find out for myself what is true for me. I am going to learn how to listen to that part of me that already knows. I'm going to learn how to detach through my practice of meditation. I'm going to learn how to detach from the noise of my mind because I am not the noise. And I'm going to spend time with the observer of the thoughts. I'm going to learn to listen to my intuition, to the still small voice, be still and know. The still small voice that reveals to me everything that I need to know. We each have wonderful, unique gifts to give to this world. But we can't give them if we are trying to live out everybody else's expectation of what we should do and how we should be. We must learn to know ourselves. We must learn to trust ourselves. And we must learn to be our authentic selves. The world doesn't need another copycat. The world needs the authentic you. Become self-reliant. Be that beautiful gift that God sent you here to be. And so it is.